Okay, good morning again, everyone. For those of you who joined us, including on the live stream, for the opening plenary of IISD's Trade and Sustainability Hub, welcome back. For those of you who have just joined us from other side events or from the Ministerial itself across the road, welcome. It's great to see you here. The idea behind this hub organised by the IISD is to bring different perspectives into the conversation on trade policy, to pick up topics that are on the ministerial agenda in the WTO over the road, but also to cover topics that are not on the agenda and to bring different perspectives to those and to have, frankly, interesting conversations about how we allocate the burden of change, around how we make the trade system fairer, and about whether we're spending government subsidies and government money wisely. I'm Alice Tipping, I lead the trade work at IISD, and it's my great pleasure to moderate this particular event. So the title of this session is You're Not Off the Hook, WTO, Why the Fisheries Subsidies Rules Matter More Than Ever. And it's a session organised by the Stop Funding Overfishing Coalition, represented by the Pew Charitable Trusts, by WWF, and by IISD, my own organisation. So let me give you perhaps a very quick overview of why we're talking about this issue precisely in the context of the WTO Ministerial, and then I'll introduce the panel of experts we have to talk about this issue and what it means. So the negative impact of fisheries subsidies has been well documented over many years, including by people on this panel, and it's been discussed at the World Trade Organization for over 2 decades. Those years and months of discussion, almost surprisingly for the WTO, led to an outcome. So in 2022, an agreement was reached at the last ministerial conference, the Agreement on Fisheries Subsidies, where all 164 members, as they were then, of the WTO, agreed on a set of rules to govern, in particular, the environmental and social impacts of fisheries subsidies. So the agreement limits subsidies provided to illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. It limits subsidies provided to fish stocks that are already overfished, as well as limiting subsidies, in fact prohibiting outright, subsidies provided to fishing on the high seas when that fishing is unregulated. And this is a huge step forward, both for sustainability, for the WTO. It is only the second WTO agreement after the organization was created and the first with an environmental objective. And it's a huge step forward towards meeting the mandate set in Target 14.6 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which specifically sets a deadline and a target for these negotiations. The agreement, as those of you who've been following the ministerial, has been ratified by 70 members now, more than halfway towards the 110 that are required for the agreement to enter into force. Yes, well done, exactly. No one is more excited than us, maybe the DG. But what's interesting is that there are 2 parallel discussions going on. There's the ratification of the agreement from 2022, and there are ongoing negotiations to finish the parts of that agreement that couldn't be agreed on a couple of years ago. And these negotiations, yes, they've been going on for a long time, but every day that passes, the negotiations and the outcome becomes more urgent. In the opening plenary, we heard that 35% of global fish stocks are now overfished. When the negotiations began, that was 25%. So the problem is increasingly, inexorably, getting more urgent. So, in a sense, members have lifted some of the pressure on themselves. They have the agreement. But I think the key message of this session is that they are not off the hook, a great play on words. Members now need to finalise the final few provisions this week. And these provisions focus on subsidies that lead to overcapacity and subsidies that lead to overfishing. To discuss why this is important, what it means, and perhaps to answer the important question of how close are we to getting these final rules on the table, I'm delighted to introduce a panel of some of my greatest friends, because we've been working on this together for many years. Rashid Soumaila, Professor Rashid Soumaila, who's the University Keelan Professor at the University of British Columbia. Yes. Sort of a mega star in the fisheries subsidies world. So we're delighted to have you, Rashid. Thank you for always turning up and remaining committed from the academic perspective to this. We have Ernesto Fernandez Monge from the Pew Charitable Trusts. Thanks, Ernesto. And the Pew Charitable Trusts have been, as a US foundation and as an institution, the most committed particularly in the last few years, and their investment and their commitment to this issue, frankly, has enabled all of the work that has gone on in the last few years. So thank you. We have Anna Bull, thank you, who has worked on fishery subsidies within WWF's Global Ocean Program, again, for years and years and years alongside us. And we have Enrique Sanjurjo, who's the Director of Pesca ABC in Mexico. And who has consistently, over the years, always helped us, those who are sort of working directly with the policymakers, to understand the small-scale fisher's perspective, right? We would constantly bombard him with, does this make sense? Can we craft an exception? What do you want in the rules? Help us to understand the ground truth of what we're trying to negotiate here. So Enrique, thank you for your commitment. Right, before I get emotional, we're going to have a first round of discussion, perhaps about just reminding ourselves again about why these rules matter. Because in crafting these things, it's important to always remember, what are we trying to achieve here? What kind of a change do we want to see? So I'm going perhaps to start with you, Rashid, if you don't mind, because you're very good at helping to set the big context of some of these questions. Why do these negotiations matter? Can you give us perhaps the historical context of how we've gotten to where we are? And then I'll turn to the next person.
Here? Yeah.
Yep.
So, why do the negotiations matter? They matter for many reasons, and many of you know this. I mean, you've been following this. Fish are important to so many people, you know. Fish is part of our ecosystem, and the ocean regulates. That's a lot of things for us. So we need to ensure that the ocean system, the marine ecosystem continues, just like other systems, actually. So it is food security, it is jobs, it is economics, and so on and so forth. I could give you numbers, but 260 million people, for example, draw some income around the world from fishing, from marine fishing. That's a lot of people, many of them young people in large developing countries who will have nothing to do without that. And just think about that. And when we talk about people in developing countries, it's not like the world is divided in such a way that what happens in those countries ultimately reaches all of us, right? Some of you saw the movie, right? Forced migration and all that. So it's important, and that's why these negotiations are important. Now, historically, like you said, the negotiations started in 2001 in Hong Kong, and it's been a struggle. All of us who have been in this, I remember my first paper was in 2002 on this, on European fishery subsidies. And since then, we've been working, building databases, working with colleagues. It's been a lot of effort by many of you in this room. And in 2022, we got Fish One. I like that terminology, actually. That's the first agreement, Fish One, which is a good achievement, because it came to a point I thought the world could never agree on anything. The polarization, oh my God, even within countries, you know. And you have all the social media, you have all the lies. You tell them this is a glass, they tell you it's a banana, until you tell them to eat it. They will eat it, they go to the next lie. How are you going to get any agreement? So this agreement, when it came, I was really happy. One of the scientists who said, this is beautiful, we have something. It's not all of what we want, but at least we have something. So that's a historical. Now, Fish One is important, but it's not enough. And it's not only us saying it, the WTO itself knows this. That's why we have this second negotiation to try to make up for what they couldn't agree. And to me, the first agreement is like, if you think of a medicine, the medical people, what we are doing with that first agreement, Fish One, is trying to cure the damage we have done so far. Like, for example, Article, is it 4, says that no subsidies to fish stocks that are already overfished. So it's a cure. They are overfished, so don't touch them. How about we prevent overfishing? And I think that is what Fish 2 brings. We want an agreement that actually doesn't take us to the point where we want to kill. We prevent the fish stocks from being overfished. And that is what this is all about. So this is very important. Why? Because it's cheap, actually. Prevention is better than cure. We all read this. I mean, the medical profession. You know, it's so cheap. The first scientist who said, if you go to the washroom and you wash your hand for 20 seconds with soap, you cut down the transmission of disease by 50%. And it was controversial. Can you imagine that? It's like those of us talking about subsidies now. It's so cheap, and now we do it. Every real washroom has got this thing, and that's what it is. It's very cheap. And the money we save, we can use it to do good stuff. We're not saying don't get money into the communities, but don't use our tax money to destroy the feedstocks that people need to survive. So that is in general why this, I think, is really important. Delegates, please give us a fish too that we can be proud of, that we can take home. I can take home to my auntie and said, yes, I came to Abu Dhabi and there was something that will protect the fish and therefore protect the fishers and the people. Remember, without fish, game over. No seafood, no income, no jobs. So before you can be a friend of fishers, some of us argue, you've got to be a friend of fish first. And I will stop here for now and pass it on to the next one.
No, that was a fantastic introduction, Rashid. Perhaps, Anna, I'll turn to you next. Essentially to expand a little bit on what Rashid said. But can you help us understand from a conservation perspective what's at stake here for fishers, for the ecosystem, and for the communities? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Alice. I'll repeat some of what Rashid just said because this is really the key of the problem. Harmful fisheries subsidies are a key driver of the global overfishing crisis, as Rashid just outlined, and overfishing and destructive fishing practices in coastal waters and the high seas degrade the fish resources that coastal communities depend on, as Rashid just said, and they really jeopardize the future of the industry they are set out to support. So a lot is at risk here for the ocean, for fishers, and for fishing communities. Healthy fish populations support the nutritional, social, and economic well-being of billions of people, as Rashid just said. And many times these people have limited or no alternatives for food or employment. And this is especially important in the light of climate change that is threatening food security by droughts, storms, etc. And really simply put, fishing communities cannot enjoy healthy economic development if they run out of fish. But Alice, as you said, if I want to perhaps enlarge the picture a little bit, if we look at the bigger picture, there is even more at risk for all of us with increasingly overfished oceans. And this has to do with the role the ocean plays in regulating the climate system and our temperatures. The ocean and coasts are really some of our strongest allies in the fight against climate change. It's both a powerful carbon sink and a heat reservoir, and many people don't really know that, but it produces 50% of the Earth's oxygen. So, as you just said, Alice, over the course of the past 20 years of WTO negotiations, on harmful fisheries subsidies that drive overfishing, about 1/3 of assessed stocks have become overfished. And at the same time, greenhouse gas emissions have increased year after year. So while governments have continuously funded overcapacity and fish populations have been pushed to the brink, the stress on the ocean is compounded by becoming hotter, more acidic, and less habitable for marine species through climate change. So with all this happening in parallel, it's clear that somehow we have to take the pressure off. And overfishing is one of the biggest threats to ocean health. Subsidies reforms supporting sustainable fisheries and reducing overfishing would really help improve ocean health. And this in turn then would help make the ocean itself more resilient to climate change. And all this can then in turn deliver the social and economic benefits that Rashid was also talking about. And just very briefly, I want to just explain why reducing overfishing plays such an important role to overall ocean health. And that's because fish and other marine wildlife do not just dwell in the ocean, but they actually make it function. And just very quickly, a few examples. When large species like fish like tuna, but also other species like whales and sharks, dive and surface, they mix the water column and bringing nutrients from the deep to the surface, which then nourish plankton and other fish. And also predator species, for example, play an important role in maintaining the balance of the marine environment by keeping populations of prey species in check. And there are, of course, many, many more examples, but I know I have a limited time to speak, but this is just to illustrate that the ocean is really a home to an unparalleled diversity of ecosystems, and subsidized overfishing poses a significant threat to the balance of this ecosystem and its functions. So the greatest challenge in addressing the global subsidized overfishing crisis is really not technical, but it's economic and political. And this is why the WTO members and these negotiations come in. We need the political will to address and realign the economic incentives that currently still fuel fleet overcapacity and overfishing. And really adopting the second fisheries subsidies agreement here at MC13 in Abu Dhabi would help make this happen.
It's very, very interesting. And I think that's exactly as you say, why the negotiations are so important and why many of us have been working for so long to help get them over the line. But maybe to move from the scientific ecosystem perspective to the perspective of the people who rely on these fisheries. Enrique, you work with many of these fishers every single day. Can you help us understand why reform of subsidies would be so important to those communities?
Thank you, Alice, and thanks, ISSD, for inviting me. My environment it's working in with the fishermen in the beach, so it's a pleasure to be once a year or once every 2 years in the suitcase and tie with so important people in the public. So thank you very much. So what I can tell is my perspective, what happened and how was the way I started understanding how fishing subsidies or reform was important. So I work every day with small-scale fishermen. And small-scale fishermen, in that time, now they are not receiving subsidy, but in 20 years ago, when I started working with them, they received subsidies. But they have tremendous problems that subsidies were not solving. Climate change was starting, and they have to adapt. There was some pollution, plastic pollution, but not as much as now, but there was some, and they have to start thinking on it. Of course, there was overfishing, and there was a crisis of lack of fisheries management. They need a lot more on fisheries management, understanding, organizing themselves, and managing the fishery. Combating IUU was also super important. And subsidies were not giving them that. So there was this need for having smarter investments on fisheries. And that was the way I approached and saying, okay, why are we using the money in that bad direction? Subsidies are not really helping to solve the problem. And that was the moment when I knew in that moment that there were these negotiations, and I have the opportunity to start working and talking with other fishing industries, the big fishing industries in Mexico, tuna, shrimp, and sardine. And more or less was the same what I obtained from them. Okay, it's nice subsidies, we like subsidies, we receive it, but they are not solving the problem. They are not solving the problem of IUU, they are not solving the problem of fisheries management, they are not solving the problem of overcapitalization. So at that moment, I didn't have the information for saying subsidies are wrong or subsidies are driving overfishing. That's Rashid, that's Rashid thing. But what I know is subsidies are not solving the problem, are far from solving the problem, and we need to invest our money in a smarter way. And at that moment, I understand that this reform is an opportunity to begin investing smarter. So negotiators, and always, or the way they work is this give and take. I give this, you take that. I take this, I give this, and I take that. But in this case, the give and take doesn't make that much sense, because having the opportunity to give subsidies will not solve anything. It's better to get rid about it and just start investing in what we need. Climate change adaptation, IUU combat, fisheries management, and I don't know how, but start dealing with pollution. And of course, investing a lot on technology. So that's the bottom line of what I want to say is this agreement, or working in fishing subsidies is an opportunity. The agreement, the text, I don't know, it has a lot of flexibility, it's a lot of things that probably don't go to the end of the problem that is getting rid of subsidies. But I said, let's go for it. Because it's a way moving forward, and it's a way for starting doing something.
Super, super interesting. Thank you very much indeed. We're going to get to the specifics of the agreement in the next round, but let me perhaps make that transition a bit with you, Ernesto, if you don't mind. Can you help us to link some of the points we've heard about from Rashid, from Anna about the science of fisheries and the importance of healthy fish stocks, from Enrique about what the communities really need? Can you help us to link that back to what's going on in the WTO agreement? And then, I promise, we'll get to the details of the agreement in the second round, but can you help to make that link for us?
Thank you, Alice. Yeah, I'll try my best. But I think I agree that to achieve a WTO agreement that will deliver on sustainable fisheries, when we see that members will consider the current state of fish populations when granting subsidies, I feel that even in Fish 1, they're already starting to do that, even though the agreement hasn't entered into force. But because when an official gets the agreement, they would read, well, subsidies are prohibited, but if I can grant them if they are sustainable. So they need to think, oh, what is the status of the fish that I am about to subsidize? So that step, I think, is hopefully achieving the objective of the agreement. So I hope both on Fish 1 and Fish 2 it will provide. There will be a catalyst for broader fishery reform. And if this is achieved with these additional rules, I believe that will be helping prevent the future overfishing, improve ocean health, protect livelihoods and coastal communities, as Rashid, Anna, and Enrique were saying. And we will be able also to revert what you mentioned at the beginning, that with the FAO data, that 1/3 of the stocks are already overfished. So we hope that with the WTO agreements, both Fish 1 and Fish 2, it will be able to start reverting, and will be a contribution for that. We are encouraged by the fact that members are discussing how to improve the text where, on Fish 2, where they left off in 2022, and see some increased level of ambition. Particularly, we can see in the text that was distributed to ministers, clear prohibition, presumption that subsidies could cause overfishing and overcapacity. There is a management exemption attached to this, but we see increased levels of scrutiny where members will need to demonstrate and ensure that the stocks are at a biological sustainable level, that are healthy. And this will provide not only members, but also civil society the opportunity to make members accountable. But the devil are in the details, as we know, and we keep hearing that some members want even more ambition, some other members want less ambition, more flexibilities. So we'll see where things land, but we are encouraged that at least there's some positive steps. And just finally, I think sustainability is not only obviously about increasing the health of the fish stocks, but as Anna mentioned, sustainable fisheries are also about, addressing employment, food security, income. This is at the end of the day what will be important from the agreement to help the communities that depend on the fish, on the stocks. And we know, because there's science that says that with a positive fishery subsidy reform, you'll be able to increase the biomass and increase the capture of fish, and this will help help the communities that depend on fish. So we call the WTO members to keep the sustainability of the fish stock at the core of the discussions, and not simply a mercantilist approach that we just preserve the problem.
Well, let's perhaps dig a little bit into some of the details, as you were saying. But in fact, maybe to take one step back, Ernesto, I thought the way that you describe the agreement is in fact a really good way of thinking about it. Because yes, at the top of the article, it often says this is an agreement to prohibit certain kinds of subsidies. What the agreement, this part of it does, in fact, is oblige governments to look at the subsidies they're providing and to match those with the degree of management of the resource, right? So in fact, it's making sure that when governments are investing, that they make sure that there are ways to make sure that the resource remains healthy. So that balance, I think, is an important one to keep in mind. But as you say, the devil is in the detail, so let's maybe dig into the detail just a little bit. And you were talking about management, and one of the sticky, difficult points in the negotiations is exactly this question of how to balance the prohibition with a requirement that governments manage their fisheries. And maybe this is a question I'll put to you, Rashid, as a professor of marine economics. What should that balance look like? How do we make sure that if there are flexibilities, that those flexibilities serve to increase the sustainability of the resource if the subsidies are provided? How do we strike that balance? In 5 minutes.
Yeah, tough question. Yeah, but I've thought a lot about this. I mean, and when I talk about subsidies or even marine protected areas, some scientists, some economists will tell them, but Rashid, why do you care? If we have a perfect management system, then it doesn't matter, right? We have a perfect management system. And this is, I think, what has led to these flexibilities being discussed for fisheries management. And my point is that really, show me one management system, show me one country that is anywhere close to perfect management. Check out all the evaluations people have done, not me, and you will see that in most cases, the countries that do the best score something like what, 60%. So there is no perfect management. That is the starting point, okay? And since there's no perfect management, what does it mean about the flexibilities? And I'm going to say something I haven't said in public before. Actually, I have come to the conclusion that you cannot have a good management system in a situation where government is giving harmful subsidies. That is not just possible. You have to think, we think of management in a traditional sense. You have stock assessment people, they go measure and they tell you how much you can take and therefore you are happy. A management system should actually be a comprehensive set of things you put together. And one of them is no harmful subsidies. Because that doesn't, it is counter to do it. You're shaking your head. That's beautiful. I love arguments and we can argue. If you have bad subsidies, you are already undermining your management system. If you don't have marine protected areas as your total management system, you are putting your whole system in risk. So a protected area must be part of your management system if it's going to work. You are shaking your head. Just like your retirement money, my dear friend, you don't put all your retirement money in Tesla, even if it is zooming every day. Your stock, your financial manager will say, be careful. So having an MPA is an insurance system built in your management system. I think this is the level of thinking we need to make. So there is a scientific issue. Number one, no management is perfect. Number two, there are very difficult requirements to even determine whether your management is good or not. I don't think more than 20% of our fish stocks are measured at all. And most of them will be in countries like Canada, maybe the EU and the US, but most of the fisheries in the developing world. And this goes to the political reason where there are issues, right? The developing countries are saying, we wouldn't be able to say whether our fish is good or bad. That means we never will get these flexibilities. Only the rich countries will get it. So you have you get back into this developing country thing. So what is my solution? Keep it simple. Keep it simple. Politicians have a way of complicating simple problems, you know. And mathematicians will simplify. They simplify to get to a solution. We need to keep it simple. Economists tell us that anytime you give a subsidy that reduces the cost of fishing or increases the price of fish, you are going to lead to more capacity because it's artificially more profitable. That is the base of all this thing. So don't give any subsidy that reduces costs or increases the price of this thing. I want to conclude by linking back to the first question. Fish 2. Fish 2 is important because we can use this to actually deal with the subsidies that lead to overfishing. And then you can get away with more of the details. The devil is in the detail. If you can avoid being with the devil in the detail, I advise you to do it. Because the devil can kill you in the details, you know. I don't want to be in the detail with the devil, no. So keep it simple, and I think this will reduce some of the tensions, especially the developing country wars. This is beautiful. I'm waiting for Q&A, and we'll have fun. Yes.
I'm double checking that we have a microphone precisely to have this conversation. Rashid, I really wish we could get away from the detail, but I think in international treaty making, you end up in the detail. I'm a lawyer. It's always about the detail. But let me pick up on a point you were making, which I think is important, and maybe ask Enrique to come in here, because you were talking, Rashid, about the sense that a fisheries management component to the prohibition or a fisheries management flexibility attached to the prohibition brought with it not just environmental questions, but also equity questions around who has good fisheries management, how is it proven, etc. And I wonder perhaps if, Enrique, I could bring you in here with your experience of fisheries in Mexico as a developing country. What kind of flexibilities, exceptions, do you think would really help small-scale fishers? Are we in the right direction here?
So, considering the state where we are, in which 5 countries get more than half of the subsidies. We have these super fleets in high seas. In Mexico, 80% of the subsidies were given to the industry. So in that context, where the big ones were taking the bigger stake, the best possible outcome was an outcome without flexibilities, just getting rid of that injustice and unfair situation with any single flexibility. That will be great because the subsidies are going on the direction to the big ones and not to fairness. And the subsidies that are given to the people are probably making them to live in a permanent situation of poverty because they are not solving the root problems in which they are. So for solving the root problems, you have to invest smarter, invest in a different way. So that will be the best. That's because negotiators are in this give and take thing. We have what we have, that it's good in some way, with some flexibilities. Some of them I like more, some of them don't. For example, I think the calendar thing for the less developed countries is good, it's having some years for adjusting. It's like, I know, I am 30 kilograms overweighted, so if I lose them in 3 days, I will probably die. I will have to lose them probably in a year or so. So that makes sense. You cannot make a big change without difficult effects. So that calendar makes a lot of sense. The idea of maybe proving that if it's not overfished, I have the right to overfish it, doesn't make that much sense. But it's a way forward because it moves in the transparency thing in the report, so we will know more about the subsidies. NGOs, we could have opinions on that. The countries that are not fishing at all, that they could give subsidies. It's not a good idea, but they are not fishing at all. They represent a very small percentage. So I will not say it's good, but I will not worry about it. So there are different. So during the details of the agreement, I cannot go do that much. I talk with Tristan, and he knows everything about the legal things and how to read every single word in that agreement. But when I say anything that moves us apart from that original situation that was super unfair and was benefiting just the big ones, anything that moves us apart from that original situation, it's good and it's a way forward, and we have to go for it.
Mm-hmm. Super constructive. And in fact, sort of speaks a little bit to the overall theme of a lot of these conversations. Can governments find their way back to cooperation? And it may not be the perfect treaty immediately, but it is a step towards that and a step towards the change that we want to see. Fantastic. Now we're going to get to the people who've been following the text, perhaps, almost as closely as my colleague Tristan, if not more. And the question you're probably all waiting for, what changes do we expect to see in this new treaty? Can you give us a sense of the changes that members might make to, or the additional provisions that may be, or at least are under discussion, may be agreed, based on what we had back in 2022, what you're expecting to see this week? I think I'll start with you, Ana, perhaps, and then Ernesto. I'd be keen on your views too. Ana, go ahead.
Yeah, happy to. Thank you, Alice. First, I think we have seen significant efforts by many to find ways to avoid running into the same problem of ultimately not finding a landing zone when it comes to disciplining subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. All of us, for sure, on this panel here today are now full of hope that all of these efforts, including those of the chair of the negotiations, will not have been in vain. And that members will be able to strike that balance between prohibitions and flexibilities in Abu Dhabi, a balance that will allow for the conclusion of an agreement, but also a balance that, most importantly, will allow to see us real changes in the ways countries will hand out subsidies to the fisheries sector, as Enrique just said, so that the impact is rather beneficial than harmful, more beneficial to the health of the fish stocks and more beneficial to coastal communities in the long term. And there are indications that this may be possible. And one key area where we have seen a departure from what was negotiated before MC12 in 2022 is the sustainability standard of Article A11. And Ernesto just alluded to that in his previous remarks. One of the, and I'll just detail that a bit more of what he just already said, but one of the key questions throughout the negotiations over the years has been whether it indeed should be allowed to continue to provide subsidies under certain circumstances. So in particular, when management measures are in place. When all of this is being discussed, it's very important to remember, of course, that the primary focus of these negotiations should lie on harmful subsidies to be reduced and to be redirected. In the context of what's been discussed at the WTO, the so-called hybrid approach is the starting point and the core of the disciplines that is being proposed in the draft agreement that ministers are now, at this moment, discussing across the road. This hybrid approach is a clear statement of a prohibition combined with an illustrative list of prohibited subsidies. And then the question is how this prohibition could be qualified by environmental safeguards or a so-called sustainability test for these subsidies to be continued to be allowed to a certain degree. And here is where we have seen a departure from previous discussions before MC12. And in that it's now, there's a tier system that is being proposed. There are different tiers for, and specific, more stringent rules for larger subsidizers. And secondly, the measures implemented by the larger subsidizers those measures must at least reasonably ensure that they can keep fish stocks at healthy levels. And I'm going to just explain that in a bit more detail. So larger subsidizers are also subject to a stricter standard in terms of timing of when the demonstration that the measures work have to be made, and in terms of the level of detail of proof that they have to provide. So while it's good from our perspective that the bar of the sustainability exemption has been slightly raised compared to earlier times in the negotiations, and Rashid just made that very clear, the risk posed to the sustainability of fish stocks by continuing to subsidize under certain circumstances remains, of course. So we expect the bar not to be lowered any further next door, hopefully. And what do we mean by that? And I'll be very brief, don't worry, but I just want to very briefly say what we hopefully will expect them not to lower. So the objective of the sustainability standard is to maintain stocks at a biologically sustainable level. That means that WTO members making use of the exemptions must ensure that this objective is met by managing their stocks in a precautionary manner. This means they must keep the risk of the fish stock becoming overfished at a real minimum. This includes that when they take decisions on how much can actually be fished, they have to take into account factors outside of their control, and that these may impact the health of the fish stock. So this may be impact of climate change or impact of invasive species, etc., etc. And they must then allow for a certain buffer when they set their fishing opportunities. So they must set those fishing opportunities accordingly, and they may need to set them lower to take those factors into account. So when members want to continue to provide certain types of harmful subsidies, they are responsible for managing their stocks in a manner that is precautionary enough for their stock not to become overfished. This is the minimum, and this is the standard that we expect them not to weaken. So in the end, from our perspective, from a conservation perspective, the main rule should be a clear obligation of the de facto restraining at the very least, as Enrique said, the largest subsidizers' unlimited ability to provide harmful capacity and effort-enhancing subsidies. And also, just generally speaking, overall, we're looking for the largest subsidizers to agree to stronger commitments, because we believe that this in turn will also help other members to also accept certain commitments, avoiding an overall race to the bottom. And for that, we, as WBF, call on WTO members not to get dug into the customary defensive positions of trade negotiations, the give and take that Enrique was referring to, but to really try to see beyond this moment, and instead of treating these talks like any other trade talk, WTO members must really recall that this agreement is fundamentally about the survival of wild animal populations and ecosystems on which billions of people depend, as we've heard so many times already today on this panel.
Super, really helpful. Ernesto, what do you think? What are you expecting to see this week?
In addition to what Anna mentioned, I think there are maybe 3 or 4 more elements that I think are critical in following with this idea that members need to find this right balance between the prohibitions and the flexibilities, both for all members, including the big subsidizers, and developing countries as part of the special and differential treatment. And I will focus a little bit on the special and differential treatment, because that in itself, there will be also need to be a balance between the different elements. Because there is a transition period for bigger developing countries. There is an exclusion for other countries that fall below a certain threshold of global catch. And there is also a flexibility for least developed countries. And there is another very important one that probably they will be discussing today and tomorrow as part of the package, which is a flexibility for small scale as we have been talking about, they need a special consideration, and I think the agreement is trying to set up that special consideration for small scales fisheries, but the important thing is how you define small scale, and I think that's what they need to try to establish a rule that is not too broad, too weak, that might be interpreted differently, and maybe members will be able to continue giving subsidies, not to specific to small scale, but maybe it could be semi-industrial or fishing or other kind. So this is important. We believe that flexibility like this should be specific for subsistence or near subsistence levels of fishing, where these communities will have, need particular attention because they are the lowest end of the development scale. So we hope that members will be able to narrow down that flexibility to address those concerns. I mean, there are elements that they can consider, like, it has to be inshore, non-mechanized, or own-operated by family, or aim at consumption of the fisheries and their families. And there are guidelines from the FAO in that respect, so this is nothing new. So this is probably going to be one of the main critical points this week. Another area that we see that will be important and will add to this balance outcome will be elements of notification and transparency, particularly on the point that Anna mentioned related to the demonstration that stocks are biological sustainable level. There is an elements that members will have to comply. There's in the text an interesting rule that requires members to notify their subsidies if they pretend to use the flexibilities. So kind of a condition, a front condition to use the flexibilities, both for any of the flexibilities, including special and differential treatment. We believe that if this made it to the agreement, I think it's going to improve one of the important elements of the WTO, which is transparency and the notifications, which we know in the WTO context is still a problem. With this consideration, maybe for developing countries, it might be important to attach some flexibilities, maybe technical assistance and capacity building, because we agree that there might be some capacity constraints. And two last points. One is that we see another important element from the sustainability perspective is that there is a provision that calls for a sort of sustainability safeguard, meaning that members, even though there's flexibilities and they will be able to continue providing subsidies, but they still need to consider the effect of the subsidies if they're causing overfishing on our capacity. So they're going back, as what I mentioned earlier, when they need to consider the subsidy programs, where the stocks are and what is the effect of those subsidies. And finally, there is another prohibition, which is they call it the contingent prohibition on subsidies for fishing-related activities beyond the jurisdiction, meaning fishing programs that are specific to fishing in the high seas and third countries, like distant water fishing. This is going to be an important and crucial element, and we have to wait and see how they decide, especially because big subsidies are attaching great importance to this. But we believe that for the credibility of the WTO, these rules should not be subject to any flexibilities, exemptions, or reduction in current levels of ambition. So, but we'll see what members decide at the end. But those are, I think, in my view, the critical elements and elements that we'll hope to see.
Super. Thank you, Ernesto. We will indeed see today, tomorrow, Thursday, hopefully not Friday. And many of us won't be getting a lot of sleep until we see exactly how these negotiations turn out. But listen, we've talked about a lot. We've talked about subsidies, the impacts they can have, the fisheries management, the importance of it, the fact that it's not perfect, the fact that many small-scale fishers rely on it to ensure the resource survives. We've talked about the importance of fisheries for ecosystems, for local communities, and the question of trying to find a balance between prohibitions and exceptions that speak to domestic concerns, but also speak to the need for equity between large fishing fleets and smaller ones. We've covered a lot on the table, and we do have time for questions from the audience, and we have our roving mic. So I'm happy to take a series of 3 or 4 and put them back to the panel before we close. I have one, Chris, and one at the back. 2 more at the back? All right. So we'll take 2 at the back, the gentleman so 3 at the back, the gentleman here, and Chris. Certainly, go ahead. You can start at the back. Thank you. Please let us know where you're from.
Hello, hello everyone. I'm Maulana. I'm from Indonesia for Global Justice, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. Happy to hear this important discussion about the fisheries subsidies agreements on WTO. There is actually some point that I want to convey in this discussion. The first one is whether WTO define the small-scale fisheries on this agreement, because there is no clear definition on it. So we need to know about how to WTO concluded the fisheries, small-scale fisheries. And then, if we are watching on the developing countries like Indonesia, Indonesia have one of the biggest producer on the fisheries sectors. Actually, in Indonesia also there is regulation that included the fishery subsidies on the regulation. So we are worried actually if these agreements, fishery subsidies agreements, will be applied in our countries, in Indonesia, for example, will eliminate the fishery subsidies that have concluded in our regulation. So there is 2 questions to the panelists. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Very, very good questions. I had, Daniel, if you can make yours. Well, yeah, there's one more at the back, if that's easy for you to get to first. And then I'll come forward. Yes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm Faikeman Saragi. I'm from the People Coalition for Fisheries Justice, based in Jakarta, Indonesia. I want to ask several questions, but the first thing is, I agree to stop funding overfishing. I agree if we fight against IU fishing, because IU fishing make a destructive fishing in Indonesia. They exploited our natural resources. Expected is fishing, and the first thing is, same like Maulana say that in Indonesia we clear about who is called small-scale fisheries, but I don't know if in the other country who is to call small-scale fisheries. Is that for the fishers who use 100 gross tons or 100 gross ton? I don't know. But in Indonesia, if we talk about small-scale fisheries, it refers to the peoples who use boat maximum of 10 gross ton. The first thing. And the second thing is, same like Maulana said, that in Indonesia, we have a regulation number 2 in 2017 and 16 that say that our government the mandate of our government, it gave our small-scale fisheries several subsidies, such as the fuel, the price for fuels, and social charge, insurance, price support for fish couch, and subsidies that cover fishing laws. And all of that was prohibited in the fishery subsidies agreement. How do you think about that? And
Yes.
once again, I'd say that we are fight against overfishing and IUU but in our opinion, the small-scale fisheries is not doing the overfishing. Thank you so much.
Super. Thank you very much indeed. When we get back to the panel, Ernesto, I might ask you to talk about the small-scale definition. No, it's not a definition. The list of qualifiers that we have in the agreement to talk about it. I had a question, I think, from Chris Horseman, and then in the front. Go ahead.
Yes, hi. I'm Chris Horseman from Borderlex. I have two questions, if I may. About a week ago, I asked Einar Gunnarsson, the chair of the fish negotiations, whether there was any definition of what constitutes sustainable fishing management in the context of flexibilities in Article 1A. And he said there wasn't, and that this would have to be elaborated through the committee procedure. So I'm wondering whether we think that we're going to have to end up having a Fish 3 negotiation to actually figure out how you define what sustainable fisheries management or a sustainable fisheries policy looks like. My second question is about distant water fishing. It seems to me that if you're a fish and you're about to get caught, you don't really care whether the net came from 2,000 miles away or half a mile away. It's going to get you anyway. So distant water, this distinction between distant water fishing and other kinds of fishing seems to be sort of ideologically based rather than sustainability based. Have I missed something, or is there actually a sustainability basis towards that debate which is going on at present? Thank you.
Super questions. Thank you very much indeed. I had one more question at the front. I can see the other hands. I'm really sorry we don't have time for them before we need to stop the live stream. But you can approach the speakers afterwards, I promise. Yes, go ahead, please.
Francisco Marie from Germany, from Development Agency in Germany. However, one remark. It's good to have this panel because I got confirmed why we were from the beginning against this agreement. First of all, you are talking about food and fish. You know well that fish is not food at WTO. It's a commodity like computers and others. It's not integrated in the agricultural agreement. So, and it is not part of human rights obligations because WTO is out of the United Nations system. So this is an own discussion of WTO, taking fish as a commodity to rule subsidies. The reason why we are discussing subsidies is because fish is not food, it's a commodity. Otherwise, we couldn't do it. But my question is that fish 1, for example, makes no sense without fish 2, because the reason why ship owners are, in parentheses, forced to fish illegally or overstock fish is overcapacity, because they need others. So the decision was from the beginning wrong to decide first IUU and overfish stocks, and now going to overcapacity. And then when we are now discussing overcapacity, there is a greenwashing for those who are illegally fishing, and we know all which fleet it is. It's Chinese fleet, nobody has mentioned it. And even those Chinese vessels which were part of overcapacity, but are now not longer under the Chinese responsibility because they have a flag of convenience, a lot of them. And we see it all in partner countries we are working on, in West Africa, in Asia and others. So the proposal now from the chair to bring those who have already overcapacity, a lot of historical subsidies, which are the reason for this overcapacity, that they can continue all the list long of subsidies if they prove that what they are doing is sustainable. This remembers me to the decision on the green box in agriculture. US and EU are continuing to subsidize their agriculture. They are building up overproduction, flooding markets in Africa and others. And this will be the same with this agreement. A green light for the major subsidizers that they are doing well, getting the improvement by their scientists. And those others, they have less capacity, scientific capacity to prove their management. They will be then accused that they are overfishing. This is totally unfair, this whole agreement, and I hope it will be not concluded.
Well, that's an alternative perspective. Speaking of green lights, I have about 2 minutes before the live stream goes off. So, can you perhaps, Ernesto, just walk us through the words that we have, well, the words that the agreement uses to approximate a definition of small-scale fishing. And then I'm going to take the distant water fishing point because I think that's an important one. And maybe, Anna, would you like to speak to the fact that that helps to try and address the equity question of who fishes where in the agreement? And then we do have to close, or we're going to get locked off.
Yeah,
go ahead.
Quickly on the artisanal exemption. Well, it seems that that element is going to be on the any agreement that the members reach. The question is, what are the elements? It's true that it's difficult to get a single definition that everybody will apply. So, and they have been discussing this for over 20 years, right? And using vessel characteristics, it's basically impossible. So what they have decided is to use socioeconomical criteria, low income, resource poor, and livelihood fishing. So then the question is a little bit how you help to define those. What are the rail guards for that? And then the other element is a geographical limitation, whether it's 12 nautical miles, 24, or even the whole exclusive economic zone. So right now in the text, I think that's what the chair suggested, but members will have to decide between these elements.
Super, extra succinct, thank you. Anna, would you like to speak to the distant water fishing nation definition of the tier, perhaps? That the fact that they're automatically included in the tier that has a stronger sustainability requirement?
Yes, I think there are two elements to that, very briefly. I think it's very important, first of all, to note that there is also a distant water provision right now that is still bracketed, that it's specifically designed to have a provision that does not allow for a sustainability exemption for those subsidies that are provided specifically for distant water fleets. And we very much would, as Ernesto said earlier, hope that this is unbracketed and adopted so that there are no sustainability management, sustainability-based exemptions for that, for those subsidies, actually. And if it's under the sustainability tier 1, yeah, it's very important that it stays there and that it's not going under tier 2. So that it's at the very least, subject to the stricter standards. That's the very minimum, if that's what you meant.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think that's when I can remember the topic coming up in the text. Listen, I know we haven't gotten to all of the questions in the room, and I do apologize for that. There is too much to talk about. But know that you can approach any of the speakers in the coffee break that follows this session, and we'd be delighted to keep talking about the agreement. Thank you for joining us, and let's wish the negotiators well as they try and strike these balances. Thank you very much. Thank you.